Thank you very much indeed, everybody, for coming along and listening to this third of the three webinars. And as with the first two, I want to thank the Institute for Social Responsibility at Edge Hill University for giving me the opportunity to talk to you all about this. And thank you all for coming to listen. Thank you for inviting me into your homes or your offices or wherever you might be. So the third webinar, it's about Liverpool's involvement in the American Civil War. The American Civil War had there were various reasons. With any war, there's a number of reasons why it might start. State rights and development of the North, the loss of the South and things like this. But essentially, 95% of it was regarding slavery and was regarding the stated wish of Lincoln to abolish enslavement in America. And this is what led to the states of the South ceding from the North, and it involved, of course, Liverpool getting involved. The main reason that Liverpool was involved was links had been forged between Liverpool and the southern states of America. We talked last week about plantations and enslaved people working on plantations, basically in areas controlled by the British Empire. But of course, the southern states of America weren't. But enormous amounts of cotton came out of the southern states of America. So like 5/6 of all the cotton trade in Britain passed through Liverpool. Links were made, family links were made. People visited, people stayed, people married. Links from emigrants from Liverpool who moved from the New York and the New England area south. So there was this connection, but it was largely cotton. We've got representation on the screen here. We've got cotton being loaded or unloaded. It could be in Liverpool, it could be any other port. I just wanted to put on to show you the size of the cotton bales and what they were. And the picture on the bottom left is actually 1912, but it could just as easily have been 50 years earlier. And that's a horse-drawn cart, obviously, piled high with bales of cotton. So this is how it was all moved about. Picture on the top left is a building that's still there. It's in Old Hall Street in Liverpool, and it's the Albany. And it was built by a chap called Christopher Naylor, who was a partner in Leyland and Bullen's bank. Leyland we met in the first talk as a slave trader to an enormous extent, and he formed a bank, and Naylor built this after he retired as a speculative development. But the reason it's so important is that this was the days before Liverpool had its own cotton exchange, but most of the people who moved into this building were cotton traders or cotton brokers. So it was a cotton exchange before there was a cotton exchange. So, you know, manufacture of cotton, cloth and thread was Britain's largest industry in the mid-19th century, the time we're talking about. Employed more than 600,000 people directly in England, and indirectly nearly 4 million people, or 1/6 of the population. They were dependent on cotton. It was enormous business, a huge business. We've got a picture on the left there of Burnley, I think it says. It could be any one of a number of Lancashire towns. The Lancashire element into it was no accident. It wasn't an accident. It's there that cotton needs damp air. If you spin cotton and it's dry, it tends to come apart. But in damp air of the Lancashire towns, before the clouds have dropped the rain and gone over the Pennines sort of thing, it's damp there. And we've got there a picture, nice stylized view, a lovely clinical view of a cotton mill. In the bottom right-hand corner. My own grandmother worked in a cotton mill when she was 8. This would be 1906, and she would work from 8 o'clock in the morning until 12 o'clock at lunchtime in the cotton mill in Bolton, and then would go to school in the afternoon. The kids fell asleep because they'd been working all that, and they didn't bother waking them up. They just left them to it. It was big business. One of the many firms directly involved in the cotton trade in Liverpool were the people who had offices within this building. Again, the building still stands. It's in Rumford Place in Liverpool. And these were the offices of Fraser Renholm. Fraser Renholm's parent company was in Charleston in Carolina, and this was a Liverpool office. And they shared the offices with 18 other companies. It wasn't a case of an enormous operation, but they were very big cotton importers. And they were also bankers. Anybody with lots of money was bankers. So they did this. During the American Civil War, the building became effectively the Confederate embassy within Liverpool, within Britain. And they were bankers to the Confederacy in Europe. They handled money. The partner from Charleston became the Secretary of the Treasury to the Confederacy. It was that important. The managing partner in Liverpool was a chap in the bottom left-hand corner there with rather exciting haircut. It makes mine look tidy. Charles Kuhn. He was a British citizen. Although he's from Charleston, he was an American, British citizen. And he married Mary Elizabeth Wright, who was described as the most beautiful woman in Liverpool. The only picture I've been able to find for it is that rather grainy one, and you really couldn't tell from there. Proilo built the house at 19 Abercrombie Square, which is now part of the University of Liverpool. And it has a blue plaque on for Noel Travass, the double VC winner. And his father was the Bishop of Liverpool, and it was the Bishop's Palace at one stage. But after Proilo had it, Proilo filled the house with Southern symbolism. In the top right-hand corner, you can see the palmetto, which is a symbol of the Confederacy. There are other things. There are cotton bolls and cotton plants in the friezes around the rooms. And in one of the rooms, it's now an office, you've got this fantastic picture in the ceiling of Proilo's family. And the people who came to Liverpool with him, the people he interacted with here, all very stylized. And there is a black person within this who would, in America, have been a slave. By the time he came to Liverpool, he would have been a servant, but treated in the same way. And he is represented as well in the ceiling. This, of course, was only the Proilo's townhouse. They had a country house, which is this building, this house in Allerton Hall, in obviously Allerton, the country house of the Proilos, and formerly the country house of William Roscoe, the connection to abolition of slavery by now being lived in by somebody who was happy to promote slavery. Proilo in 1860, before the war had started, the winter of 1860, commissioned this gun, this artillery piece. The photograph on the left is the actual weapon. It's in a town called Galena in Illinois. And it was captured from the Confederates because Proilo sent it to his hometown of Charleston as a present. And it was among the guns. It was sent personally present to General Beauregard. One of the guns that fired on Fort Sumter at the start of the American Civil War in April 1861. It was a rifled gun, which means it had spiral down the barrel, which meant that the projectile spun as it was fired, which meant it was more accurate. And I say it was captured. It's in a place called Grant Park in Galena. Galena is a strange town, a town of about 3,000 people, lead mining town, obviously called Galena. And they produced, Ulysses S. Grant came from there, and I think it was 6 other officers of general rank in the Northern Army came from there. There was somebody very inspirational to young lads there. But you can see the picture on the right is the inscription that was on the back of the gun, and it says Fawcett Preston and Co. Liverpool. Fawcett Preston come into the story again in a short time. This is the 1853 Enfield rifle musket. By the 1860s, the main weapon of the British Army, but also a very desirable weapon. It was a very accurate weapon. It was slightly slower in loading than the musket because, again, a rifle barrel, but it matters not. These were produced, they were sold in great numbers by Brown Shipley, the American-based merchant bank who were in Liverpool, who incidentally were enormous cotton importers, but they worked very closely with the federal government in America, and they supplied enormous quantities of these rifled muskets to the north. But the Confederate agents in Liverpool also supplied enormous quantities to the southern states. So you had British weapons being used by both sides, supplied by Americans in Liverpool to their allies in the States. Almost as soon as the American Civil War started, Lincoln ordered a blockade of the southern ports. And we've got a nice cartoon of the time. Cartoons are something of a bit of a hobby of mine. I quite like cartoons. And it's called Scott's Great Snake. And it shows that the snake surrounding the Confederacy and blocking it off. Very good reason for this. The Confederate, or the Southern people, had relatively little industry. Their business was tobacco and cotton. And this would be exported from the South. For that matter, it would be sent to the North. It would be exported from the South, and into the southern states would come the necessities of life and the luxuries and what have you, paid for by the merchants who sold the cotton. You never sail a ship empty, by the way, so you bring back stuff with it. So by blockading the South, the Lincoln and his government thought this will suffocate the South. It will stop them getting raw materials in, it will stop them getting weapons in, and all this sort of thing. And that was the plan. However, it didn't quite work. The blockade was not totally effective for quite a time, to be honest. It took a long time before they could make it fully effective. And a lot of British and some French ships ran through the blockade. So we've got here roughly 1,300 times attempts were made to run through the blockade, and around about 1,000 of those times were successful. And almost all the successful runs began in Liverpool, and the successful ones also ended there, although we've got here a picture of a blockade runner. They were known as Grey Phantoms, an early attempt to camouflage ships that wasn't done before. They were painted grey, and you can see at the front of the bow, the ship, there's a sort of covered bit. It was called a turtle back. It kept the water out of them. These were fast ships. Ships would not go from Liverpool to the southern ports. They would go from Liverpool to Nassau in the Bahamas or Havana in Cuba, and there transfer the goods onto these ships, Grey Phantoms, and they would then go into the South. Now, a lot depended on who was sending the ships. Fraser Renholm, we've seen before, their officers, they largely were sending war material. They were sending weapons, they were sending cartridges, gunpowder, goodness knows what else. The ships from Liverpool, for the most part, not exclusively, but for the most part, were sending cash goods. They were sending flushing toilets, they were sending dresses, cognac, champagne, wine, all the things that the South had bought before, they were sending again now. The shippers in Liverpool knew what to send because they've been sending it for years. They've been dealing with the South. So look here, the same time this is going on, the fact of the blockade severely restricted the amount of cotton that could come out of the South. But it affected the people in Lancashire horrendously. There were, it was called the cotton famine, not especially because there was a dearth of cotton, but that it caused a famine in Lancashire. People were put out of work. Cotton operatives, we saw how many people directly involved in the cotton aid were put out of work and were fed by the parish. But Liverpool, it didn't quite work the same. Say in 1860, if you look at the street directories for it, there were around 200 cotton brokers and dealers, but by the end of the American Civil War, 65, there were about 300 of them. This isn't sounding like a business that is suffering too much. They've increased numbers. And at the end of the American Civil War, there were over 400,000 bales of cotton in warehouses in Liverpool. Compared with what they're bringing in, sort of 1.72 million bales, 400,000 isn't a great amount. But what was happening was the Liverpool brokers, the Liverpool dealers, were speculating in cotton. Cotton would change hands. People who had a lot of money would buy cotton as it became available from the blockade runners. They'd bring the cotton out, still they're bringing tobacco out, but mainly cotton. And they would buy it in the hope of the price rising, and the price did rise. So they made a profit on it and they sold it to perhaps another speculator. And I wouldn't say, certainly wouldn't say there's enough cotton to have kept Lancashire completely in business and to have avoided the cotton famine, but there was cotton in Liverpool and people were making money out of it because the prices were going up. We've got here a couple of cartoons. I warned you, cartoons are my hobby. We've got John Bull outside the cotton stores whilst two people are fighting in the door, and that's the federal government and the southern government. And John Bull is looking at them fighting, and he said, "Oh, if you two like fighting better than business, I shall deal at the other shop." And the other shop is there on the left there, the Indian Cotton Depot, because cotton started to come in from India and from Egypt into Liverpool. And then we've got a position, the captions aren't important in this. What the situation is showing in the left is John Bull, who always represents Britain, supplying the southern states with weapons, and there's a lot of muskets and swords and ships and cash as well there. Whereas on the right, Uncle Sam is providing corn and flour to those starving in Lancashire. The cotton operatives in Lancashire wrote to Lincoln and said how they supported him in stopping enslavement and freeing the enslaved people. And generally speaking, the working class of Britain during the American Civil War supported Lincoln and his view. What I find, excuse me, slightly difficult about that is that, you know, in 1860, they're saying we don't want to deal in cotton produced by enslaved people. You just ask yourself who they thought had produced the cotton for the previous 80 or 90 years that they've been dealing in cotton. You know, it had come from enslaved people and it wasn't an issue. So, you know, it's, I don't know, perhaps selective amnesia there. So here we have a couple of blockade runners, the Banshee, the first steel shipped across the Atlantic and built by Jones Quiggin in Liverpool, and the one there, the Colonel Lamb, which is also by Quiggins, and after the American Civil War sold to Brazil, loaded with a shipment of explosives to go to Brazil and exploded in Liverpool docks. So never got to be owned by the new people. But Jones Quiggin were big builders, Bowyer and Chaffer, who were in Seacombe on the Wirral, Lairds, who we'll see about more in a minute or two, in the Wirral, were building ships, and Fawcett Preston, who built the gun that we saw earlier on that Proilo had sent to Charleston. They were, as well as making artillery, they also made steam engines, and they supplied steam engines for ships built by all sorts of companies. And we're going to see another ship in a while that was the steam engines were produced. It's a similar concept. The steam engine needs a pressure vessel, and a gun is a pressure vessel. And interestingly enough, Fawcett Preston still exist. They call themselves Fawcett's now, and they make turbines for tidal power, which is a similar idea, another pressure vessel. They've stuck to their business there. Here is one of the people who was involved in the blockade running. It's quite important because in 64, 65, he was mayor of Liverpool. And of course, the war is coming to its eventual end there. But Sir Edward Lawrence, mayor of Liverpool, cotton trader, number of blockade runners. From 1863, he was the director of the British and Foreign Marine Insurance Company. He was chairman of the Liverpool Gas Company. 1874, he proposed the foundation of a university college in Liverpool. That would be the University of Liverpool. In 1889, he was director of the Liverpool Overhead Railway. And from 1894, a director of the Bank of British West Africa. He is what we might now call the establishment personified. And he is heavily involved in blockade running, in making a profit out of cotton coming out of the South, making a profit out of goods going in to the South. He's Liverpool establishment. And it might be, I don't know if it's unfair or unkind or what, he was making money, but also his actions and the actions of the other blockade runners were lengthening the war. They were making the war last longer. They were increasing the suffering of the enslaved people by postponing, by delaying the inevitable abolition of slavery. So he was involved. This is why Liverpool's involvement in slavery runs through into the American Civil War. The South was sometimes looked upon as you know, a refined agricultural society, and I think that's still a degree of a view that some people have now. I think that if you look at Gone with the Wind, you know, it's a nice, genteel, in inverted commas, English society, and you know, the fact is, we all know that it was done literally on the blood of the enslaved people. There's another couple of blockade runners, two brothers. On the left there, Arthur Bowyer Forward. That's his statue in St. John's Gardens, back of St. George's Hall. And on the right, William Bowyer Forward. And they made an initial fortune. They were merchants. The father was a merchant. And you see by the dates of their birth, they were young men, and they got heavily involved in blockade running and made an awful lot of money out of it. But again, these people are the establishment. So Arthur Forward, mayor of Liverpool, 78 to 9. 1885 to his death, the Conservative MP for Ormskirk, supported an Episcopal see, the cathedral in Liverpool, and a university college in Liverpool, Liverpool University. Oddly enough, for a Conservative MP of this time, he was also in support of universal suffrage. He wanted women to get the vote. He was in support of employers' liability, that employers should have a duty of care to their workers, old age pensions and social housing, remarkable for the day. And we'll talk about universal suffrage. He supported all this, but was blind to the abuses that he was perpetuating by his blockade running. His brother, William, was Lord Mayor of Liverpool. Liverpool had become a city in 81, so he was one of the first, in fact, the second Lord Mayor of Liverpool. Raised money for the building of the Liverpool Overhead Railway, director of the Cunard Line, director of the Bank of Liverpool. We spoke about them in the first point. President of the Seamen's Orphanage, treasurer of the committee that raised money for the building of the cathedral, and High Sheriff of Lancashire. Again, these people are the establishment. They're, you know, they're the posh people in Liverpool, to use a strange expression. I apologise. Enter very early. The talk jumps about a bit, I'm afraid, just because of how I had to do it, and I apologise this. Enter the story in 1861, very soon after the start of the American Civil War. The picture on the left, a brother and his half-brother. The chap on the left there with the extravagant facial hair is James Dunwoody Bullock, who was a captain. He was operating out of New York, or one of the northern ports, but he was a southerner, and he joined the South when they ceded. And Bullock was sent to Liverpool. And Bullock's brief when he was sent to Liverpool, as an agent at the South, was to acquire a fleet for the Confederacy. Now, the US fleet, whilst badly organized and not enforcing their blockade desperately well, was a large fleet and an efficient fleet, and largely, well equipped with decent modern ships. As a small and poor outfit as the South was, they couldn't challenge these ships on the high seas. So they did what other people did in the past with less able navies. They decided to go for commerce raiding. Now, commerce raiding is most familiar to most people by the actions of the U-boats, the German U-boats in the First and Second World War. That was commerce raiding. You try and avoid the enemy's superior naval power, and you concentrate on their merchant ships, not as well armed, perhaps not as fast, and you strangle the trade of a country by sinking their merchant ships, by making their merchants afraid to put the ships at sea. So James and Woody Bullock came across first. Irving Bullock, his half brother, came across later. We'll see where Irving fits into it a little bit later. 12 Wellington Street in Waterloo is where James and Woody Bullock lived. He also lived at number 10 at one stage. And the piece of silverware in the right-hand picture, the Bullock ewer in the Liverpool Town Hall. If you go into the Town Hall through the central entrance where the staircase is, the glass cases on the right there, the Bullock ewer is there. And this is something he was given by grateful passengers on a merchant ship that he was in that was involved in a terrible storm, and ship had all sorts of problems. He got everybody safely to home, and the passengers had a whip round and presented him with this, and his daughter presented it to the city. So you can see that it's inscribed there. Bullock, as well as living out in Waterloo, did a lot of his planning and a lot of his meetings in Waterloo, and the Liver Hotel was a favourite place. This is at the main road that goes through Waterloo that heads up towards Crosby and ultimately towards Southport. Junction was a set of traffic lights where I've never once been through that traffic lights without stopping in any direction. But there's a photograph and a Confederate flag inside the Liver Hotel there. Bullock didn't go home after the American Civil War. He died in a house in Canning Street, his daughter's house. He died of cancer in 1901, and he is buried in Toxteth Cemetery. And there's his grave. It's somewhat overgrown. That's a picture I took a couple of years ago. I imagine it might be worse now. But around the base of the grave, it says, an American by birth, an Englishman by choice. He didn't have too much choice in it. The officers of the Confederacy after the war were given a general amnesty. The general amnesty did not extend to James and Woody Bullock or to his half-brother. So they're both buried in Liverpool. We'll talk more about that at the end of the talk. So Bullock set about getting this these commerce raiders together, and the first one he sorted out was the CSS Confederate States ship Florida. It was in William C. Miller's yard in Toxteth. Fawcett Preston owned it. Yeah, they were the owners, and Bullock bought it from them. They made the guns, they made the engines, and it sank or captured 37 federal merchant ships. The ownership of ships was peculiar because with the blockade runners, once the Confederate commerce raiders had gone to sea, that didn't matter. They were owned by the Confederate government. But the commerce raiders tended to pass ownership. They'd be owned by one person or one group of people for 6 or 12 months, and then ownership would pass to somebody else. And it was trying to keep ahead of the British government, cracking down on them. So here we have this about perhaps the best known of the commerce raiders, the south of the Confederacy, was the CSS Alabama, which was built in Laird's Yard in Birkenhead. and a little picture of Laird's Yard there. But on the left, we have the first page of the order from Laird's order book. It's in the Wirral Archives in Birkenhead, and the contracting parties are John Laird and Sons and James Dunwoody Bullock Esquire in person, not on behalf of the Confederate government, because the British were neutral in the American Civil War, and there was a declaration of neutrality which forbid the British citizens being involved on either side in the war. So it wasn't, they couldn't contract it to the Confederacy because that would break the Neutrality Act, and so it was Bullock himself. But it's very interesting that they didn't have the £47,500 to pay for this. And Fraser Renholm said, if the Southern government do not come up with the money, we will pay the £47,500 to pay for the ship. So this was built, and there was a lot of subterfuge over it. There was, it was given another name. It was called the 290 to begin with, because it was number 290 on Laird's order book, things like this. And the British government were aware that it was an enemy warship, and they wanted to stop it from sailing. And it went to a court case, and this is 88 Rodney Street, the Upper Parliament Street end of Rodney Street, and the Home Office of Frederick Hull. He was an Admiralty solicitor, and he managed to convince the British government that the Alabama was not a warship. Now, the Alabama's basic style, it was individually designed, but it was basically a British frigate of the time. The ship, when it was in Laird's, had traverses, iron or brass traverses on the deck for guns to rotate about. The deck was strengthened in various places for the guns to be mounted. You couldn't mount them just on an ordinary deck because the recoil would force it through. They were strengthened. The ship had a magazine. This is rather like, say, what Hull managed to do. It was like Hull convincing the government that an aircraft carrier wasn't a warship because it didn't have aircraft on it. In fact, it had the ability to have aircraft on it. So I apologize about the dogs, they're upset by something. So here we have the Alabama, a very famous painting of it there on the left, and a picture of Raphael Semmes, the captain, leaning against one of the guns. It was a 110-pounder that was in the middle of the ship to rotate. The guns of the Alabama, again, were made at Force of Preston. The engines of the Alabama were made at Force of Preston in Liverpool. The Alabama had for what it was doing, for what its job was, a very successful career. And it was sunk eventually in 1864 off Cherbourg in France. It was put into Cherbourg for repairs. And by French neutrality rules, it was only allowed to stay there for a time. It came out. The USS Kearsarge was waiting for it, and there was a battle just off the coast of Cherbourg, and the Alabama was sunk. Interestingly enough, a steam yacht, the Deerhound, was in Cherbourg, purely coincidental, I'm sure, registered in Liverpool. The owner was in the Royal Mersey Yacht Club, as a lot of people were, and that rescued a lot of people, including Semmes and most of the crew. And the officers of the Kearsarge demanded, by speaking to, that the Deerhound brought the people who they'd rescued to the Kearsarge for to be arrested, and instead the Deerhound sailed to Britain. So the Earth and America was duly upset about this, as you can imagine. So the CSS Alabama sunk 64 Union, Federal, Northern ships, merchant ships, and one warship. This made it the most successful blockade runner of certainly in modern times, of recorded times, certainly. 65 ships is more than the most successful U-boat in either the First or Second World War sank. It was that important. It was that devastating, if you like. Another little cartoon there, which is called The Approach of the British Pirate Alabama. The Alabama was never British. the Americans would put it out as being a British pirate. And, you know, it was very much an attitude of the North. We see another cartoon later that supports that. Lairds were also contracted to build these two ships, and the Laird rams. They had a pointed bow section beneath the water that if would punch holes in a ship. They had guns in turrets. They were iron ships. They were very powerful, enormously powerful ships, to the extent where Charles Francis Adams, the US minister, the ambassador to London, wrote to Lord John Russell, and he said, make no mistake, if these ships sail, it will be war. These ships could potentially have sailed into the Potomac, just knocking American ships out of the way and shelled Washington, in theory. They were impounded by the British government before they could sail, and they were taken into the Royal Navy, which is, they were HMS Scorpion, HMS Wyvern within the Royal Navy. The South, the Confederacy, were not the only people to have a presence on the ground, of course, in Liverpool. This chap, Thomas Haynes Dudley. Thomas Haynes Dudley was a lawyer, and he was a member of Lincoln's campaign team when Lincoln was elected. And Lincoln sought to reward him for his efforts, and he offered him one of two posts. He could go as a minister or ambassador to Tokyo, or he could go as consul, US consul to Liverpool. And he went to Liverpool, and he chose to go to Liverpool because he said the medical facilities were better there. Dudley was a man who enjoyed ill health. He was always poorly, and in letters back to the State Department, he keeps saying, can I come home? I'm not well, this sort of thing. He lived to quite a ripe old age. It was, I think the expression is a creaking gate. But Dudley was refused permission to go back to America. They said, look, you are running this counterintelligence, this counter-espionage thing. You're finding out all the information about the blockade runners, about the commerce raiders and things like this. You're very important. And it was Dudley's evidence, Dudley put a lot of evidence together that led to what was known, well, the documentation in the, what they call it, the Geneva Tribunal of Arbitration in 1872, 7 years after the war. These were known as the Alabama claims. And the American government claimed from the British government $15.5 million and more, in fact, saying that you were aware of what was going on and you failed to stop it. You could have stopped the Alabama. You could have done this, you could have done this, and you didn't do it. And was there said earlier that the British working class were largely in support of the North? The upper classes and the establishment, we've seen some of the establishment already, were more supporters of the South, of the Confederacy. And they say, you could have done this. So Dudley prepared most of this. I have a copy of the American submission to it, and I was hoping to have it and include it in this, or just to show it to you today. I can't find it. If you look behind me, and this was the first international tribunal, first international arbitration tribunal. And so at the end of it, they denied the American claims for indirect damages, but ordered Britain to pay the United States $15.5 million in compensation. So here we have another cartoon. We'll look at the cartoon first. And this is again John Bull, evidence of John Bull. John Bull has a pound sign for one of his eyes, blinding it, and his other eye is open. And he's saying on that, all right, Semmes, fire away. Semmes was the captain of the Alabama we just talked about. Be off, you damn Yankee thing. And then at the bottom, he's saying, a few more pirates afloat, and I'll get all the carrying trade back in my hands. The transatlantic carrying trade was enormously important to Liverpool, enormously important generally. And what happened was that the American flagged ships struggled to get insurance. While the Alabama, the Shenandoah, the Florida, other ships were out there, they struggled to get insurance. And whilst the Americans had, in about 1859 or something, shifted the balance, so they had more than 50% of the carrying trade. By the end of the war, they had lost a lot of it, and some like 75% of the carrying trade came back to British ships, British companies, and predominantly Liverpool companies. So this was never an intention of Bullock in what he was doing. It's never intention of the South, but it greatly improved things in Liverpool, that they got the carrying trade back, lucrative carrying trade. So what they're saying that for sort of 800,000 tons of shipping to foreign carriers avoided. British flagged ships were safe. The Alabama would not attack a British flagged ship. So an unintended consequence, one of great value, enormous value to Liverpool. They maintained the superiority in the carrying trade until 1940, until the start of the Second World War. St. George's Hall was involved in the American Civil War. It sounds very peculiar, but St. George's Hall familiar. I've included just a picture here of the pediment on the side of, I can't work out if it's the south or the west side, I don't know. Anyway, the side facing away from the Walker Art Gallery. The pediment was there, it was taken down because it was unsafe, it was falling off. And then you have a picture of it across the bottom of the screen there. And on the right, you've got a section of the pediment, and it shows a freed, a liberated, enslaved person there. Liverpool tied in to slavery, all this. And this is from the 1850s when St. George's Hall was made, well after the abolition of slavery, and Liverpool is saying, look, aren't we wonderful? We've freed all these enslaved people. We enslaved them in the first place. The irony wasn't lost, well, was totally lost on them, sorry. In 1864, October 1864, there was a grand Southern Bazaar in St. George's Hall. That's the interior of it there. And somebody selling tickets to, frankly, what could have been anything, but I'm choosing to say it's in aid of the Grand Southern Bazaar. And there were stalls in, largely run by people who were lady this and lady that. It was a women's thing that promoted this. And they were raising money for Southern prisoners of war who were having a fairly desperate time of it in northern prison camps. There was obviously no Geneva Convention to ensure the rights of prisoners, and it was fairly desperate. Mrs. Proilo was very involved in it, and Mrs. Spence from Liverpool was heavily involved in it. Lots of people came from out of Liverpool as well to have these. There was one in Paris as well, I believe, but a big one in Liverpool. Very grainy picture of it, I'm afraid, but it gives you an idea. And they were raffling things and selling things, you know, Robert E. Lee's autograph or somebody else's hat or this sort of thing. And they were successful. They raised around about £20,000. And the thing is, at the end of the war, sort of less than a year later, 6 months later, this money was still in Liverpool, this £20,000, because they'd offered it to the federal government for the relief of Southern prisoners, and it was declined. The offer was declined. The federal government wouldn't accept the money. As it stayed in Liverpool and transferred eventually to America after the end of the war for the relief of prisoners who had suffered in prison camps. They were all given their indemnity and allowed to go back to their lives, but several of them had suffered greatly and was given for that. As Liverpool, the people of Liverpool were supporting the South there. One of the other commerce raiders was this one, the CSS Shenandoah. The CSS Shenandoah was bought by James Dunwoody Bullock, we've seen already, and his father-in-law was the owner of it when it was bought. It was a British merchant ship, and it was converted into a warship. And I say he bought it off his father-in-law. This is sharing ownership and transferring ownership of ships to try and throw the British government off the track. Sankor captured 38 ships, northern ships, and fired the last shot of the American Civil War sometime after April 1865, when the war officially ended. They were up in the North Pacific, and they were attacking the North's whaling fleet up there. Found out about the surrender when they were off San Francisco. The aim had been to go into San Francisco and lay waste to anything they could find shipping-wise. And instead, they realized the war had ended, and it said they chose to make the journey from California to surrender not to a northern port, but they came back to Liverpool. The guns were taken off and put in the hold, so it was no longer a warship. And Irving Bullock, James and Willie Bullock's brother on it, was an officer on this, and he navigated a course back to Liverpool out of the main shipping lanes. They didn't come across, I think they saw a couple of ships in the distance, but they didn't come across any ships, and they sailed into Liverpool in November 1865. There's a picture of the deck of the Shenandoah. I'm not sure, I don't think that is Captain Waddell, who's the captain. I think he's one of the other officers, and sailors doing what everybody does when you put up a camera in those days, looking straight at the camera. But the surrender of the CSS Shenandoah in the Mersey, 6th of November, was the last act of the American Civil War. So you're talking about the gun that Proilo sent was involved in the attack on Fort Sumter, was perhaps the beginning of the Civil War. The very last act of it was here. The Shenandoah came into the Mersey, and it surrendered to HMS Donegal, and it was Captain Painter was the captain of Donegal. The Donegal was the Mersey guard ship. Mersey had a guard ship to protect against any attacks and things. The Southern officers had committed no crime under British law, and had not broken any British Neutrality Act, and were just allowed to go straight away. The crew of the Shenandoah, as the crew of the Alabama had been, a lot of the ordinary sailors on it were from Britain. A lot of them from Liverpool, a great number of them from Liverpool, excuse me, Glasgow or Belfast. And Painter got the crew of the Shenandoah on the deck, a party of Marines behind him, and started to do a roll call. And as he read out the names, he said, "And from where are you from?" And the first person said in a very Scouse accent, "The South Sea." And they went from one to the other, and in various accents of Scottish, Irish, and Liverpool accents, they all claimed to be the South, and Painter let them go. It wouldn't have done anything to charge these people with breaking the Neutrality Act and had trials and what have you, and it was better just to close the page in the book. Lieutenant Commander James Waddell, who surrendered, the Shenandoah, had a nervous breakdown and went to the Royal Waterloo Hotel at Waterloo, the Royal Hotel it's called now, at Waterloo, to recuperate before going back to America. The Shenandoah was sold to an American company and was damaged in a storm, and then was damaged in a second storm, and I'm just trying to remember if it actually made it back to America or not. I don't think it did. Now, the legacy of the American Civil War in Liverpool, it's a sort of some concern in some ways, because there was almost a celebratory aspect to the legacy of the American Civil War. It prolonged enslavement in America. It prolonged the sufferings of the enslaved people. And yet we've got these plaques, these 6 plaques, are all on the house at Rumford Place that we saw, Fraser Renholm's offices in Rumford Place. And we've got Bullock House there, Alabama House, Enrica, which is what the Alabama was called when it was being built, Charleston House, Fraser Renholm, long tracks with Charleston, a plaque to the people who left Britain to participate in the American Civil War, quite a lot, we're talking hundreds, people put as high as 1,000. Starving people from Lancashire thought, well, you know, at least I'll get some money, I'll go off and I'll fight predominantly for the North, although some did fight for the South during the war. And there's a plaque to the Shenandoah, which I'm going to talk about more in a little bit. Over the entrance through Rumford Place, that goes to a car park now and a courtyard at the back of the building, we've got this. It says through the arch 2, 8s and the numbers. But there it says CSS Alabama, and you've got 3 people represented there. You've got agent, it says, which is James W. Bullock, middle president Jefferson Davis, the only president of the Confederate States, and master, which is Semmes, who was the master of the CSS Alabama. And to my mind, you've got, again, the palmetto, and you've got the Southern Confederate flag there. To my mind, again, this is something celebratory nature here of the Civil War. This is a relatively new addition within St. James's Gardens. St. James's Gardens is the cemetery at the back of Liverpool's Anglican Cathedral. And it's a plaque, and it's high, very high on the wall. And I don't know how long it's been. I don't think it has been there that long, but it was pointed out to me. For George Harwood, CSS Alabama and CSS Shenandoah, and Confederate States Army. And again, it's celebratory of Harwood. Harwood was a Liverpool man, and he was certainly Alabama. When Semmes got back to the southern states, having been saved from drowning when the Alabama sank, he became a general in the Confederate Army. And this is why I'm guessing Harwood might have been involved in the American Army side. I can't think why else, but Semmes' crew, who were gunners, became artillerymen in the Confederate Army. This, I think, is very worrying, because this goes back to 2009, and it's a rededication of the grave of Irving Bullock. We sort of, that's the white grave in the middle of the picture there. And it is attended by Mike Story, the then Lord Mayor of Liverpool. You can see him on the picture in the top left there, on the left-hand side of it with his gold chain on it. It's rededicated by the sons of Confederate veterans and daughters of the Confederacy. Both of these are neo-Confederate organizations. On both the graves, you can see it on both the graves. I'm sorry, the postman is just walking up the courtyard. If he comes to the house, the dogs will bark. I apologize about that. And they're a couple of rooms away, but you'll still hear them. They've both got those black star or cross things, not stars, cross on them. And there is a picture in the bottom left-hand corner there, which I took in America quite a few years ago now. And it's called the Southern Cross, the CSA, standing for Confederate States of America, with the Confederate battle flag, with a laurel wreath around it indicating victory. And both of these graves had those on. I went a couple of years ago to the City Council saying, is it entirely appropriate that they have these things on there? They are celebratory of the Confederacy. And I went to take a photograph earlier this year of them for the book I'm finishing off at the moment. And I was interested to see that both of them have been removed. So I'm guessing, only guessing, that it was the City Council that have removed them. But you can see the celebratory nature of this rededication. And a further one, the plaque to the crew of the CSS Shenandoah was installed in 2015 by Sons of Confederate Veterans. And there you have them by the plaque. And the plaque says, in honor and memory of the officers and crewmen who so courageously served on the Shenandoah. People reckon, reading around it, that the actions of the commerce raiders in America added something like 2 years to the Civil War. So doubled from 2 years to 4 years, perpetuated slavery, perpetuated the suffering. I doubt the wording on this. It wasn't courageous with a heavily armed warship to attack unarmed merchant ships. That is not courageous. I'm sorry. You've got the flags there showing the present American Stars and Stripes and the Confederate naval flag and the Union flag there. This is also, sorry, this is in Rumford Place where Fraser Renholm's offices were. I was thinking back when I was looking at obviously this talk and the first two talks, and I was thinking there is a common link, I believe, in Liverpool's involvement in slavery that runs through the slave trade, the plantation and plantation business, crops cultivated by enslaved people, and by compensation for freeing your enslaved people, and the work in the American Civil War. And I think that I may be wrong, I'd be interested in your views if you want to email me afterwards, please, that the link is money, that the people of Liverpool wanted to make money. And this is a quotation from the Guide to Bristol from 1794, a chap called W. Matthews, about whom I know nothing, but he said, and he's talking about the slave trade here, while the people of Liverpool, in their indiscriminate rage for commerce and for getting money at all events, have nearly engrossed the trade. And if you think about it, he's referring to the transatlantic slave trade here. Indiscriminate rage for commerce, getting money at all events, the plantations, the sugar, everything else that came from the Caribbean and the Americas, cotton, blockade running. The commerce raiders were funded and organized by Americans in Liverpool. The blockade runners were almost entirely, having said that, no, Fraser Renholm were heavily involved, but very often involved by the British in Liverpool. And an indiscriminate rage for commerce and getting money at all events. It was money. They were looking for money out of it. 3 books I could suggest: Lincoln's Man in Liverpool, Concept, an excellent book, fabulous. British Blockade Runners, there, again, excellent book. Grey Raiders of the Sea, I'm very aware of time here. Chester G. Hearn, by the way, is no relation at all to me. He is not related to me. I have spoken to by email in the past, and we've decided we're definitely not related. Excellent reads, all of them. Please have a look at those. And from the Devil's Nest, the company that my son and I run, I've got 2 books about slavery: Slave Streets of Liverpool and One Day in the Liverpool Slave Trade. Was there a proposal to offer freed slaves paid employment and equal treatment when slavery was abolished? The slaves go on strike, or they simply dismissed or refused further employment? The Irish held riots in several cities in America because they thought that once freed, the enslaved people would undercut them wage-wise. They were doing the poorly paid jobs. For the most part, the enslaved people, once freed, stayed on the plantation. Some obviously left and went to other jobs, but many of them stayed where they were. The Americans had to march 2 battalions of infantry with their supporting artillery back to New York to quell the riots, and a British frigate that was in New York at the time put a shore party onto the docks in New York and said, send your black sailors to us because we'll protect them, because there were a lot of black people murdered in New York and buildings burnt down and all sorts. And thank you again for listening.